Hello, everybody. So today I want to discuss the 7 stages of grief that you might go through when you're dealing with your adult child who has gone astray. And you might be familiar with the 5 stages of grief, and there's another model out there that includes two additional steps in the process that I found very valuable. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Sally Harris, and I help desperate moms of defiant adult children. I help them create a plan and use proven strategies and techniques to overcome their anxiety and provide peace and hope. And so I will put a link below to my discovery call. You can click on that link and book 30 minutes with me for free to discuss what's going on with your adult child, and we can dive into that and see how I can help you. So as far as today's topic, like I mentioned, there's 5 stages of grief that most of us are familiar with are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Obviously, grief goes across the spectrum, right? I used to think that grief was only when someone died. So when I was going through this with my daughter, I didn't realize until actually a counselor had kind of pointed it out to me, and she said, "You're grieving." And it kind of clicked, and I thought, you know what, you're right, I am, because I'm bouncing back and forth between these stages all the time. And you can grieve someone who has not passed. So grief comes in all different shapes and sizes and for different reasons. And so the 7-stage model is a little bit different, where it includes the first stage is shock. So instead of starting with the denial, the first stage is shock. And if you have an adult child that's gone astray, I'm sure you can agree with me that you are in that particular stage quite often. You tend to get shocked over and over again. And it's kind of that initial paralysis at hearing the initial bad news, right? So we go through that many times, and it literally can put our whole body in shock. So these stages, they're not in a particular order, although they do list them in an order in which we typically see, but you can bounce back and forth. Sometimes you skip a stage, but most frequently, so your shock would be the initial. Second would be denial, where we are trying to avoid the inevitable. I think that's just human nature. And it's shortest lived for many, but reappears often, where you could be doing well and then a memory clicks in your head, or maybe you go back to shock stage and you end up in denial again each time that you get shocked again. So that's something to keep in mind. And the next one is anger. So after the denial, we become angry. And that's frustrated outpouring of bottled up emotion. So that's something to consider. And it's our mind's way of fighting back on what we're trying to process. And the anger can be at yourself. It can be at others. And it's a hard one to sit in. And I know that that's one that I sat in a lot. I would find that I would go between anger and then bargaining, which is the next one, and I would do that, and then literally I would sit in the depression stage for the longest time until I got to my acceptance. But we'll go into that in just a second. So after the anger stage is bargaining, and that is where you're literally seeking a way out. We try to control things, right? We try this option, we try to do this. We're like, well, if I say this, then they'll do this. And if I stop giving them money, or if I do give them money, we try to bargain our way into like how we're going to make this change happen and get out of this grieving process. So that's bargaining. And then the next one is depression. And that's the scariest one to be at. Like I mentioned, I think I stayed there the longest. And that is where you really have final realizations of the inevitable. And also with that, unfortunately, I think we end up putting ourselves in our mind in the situation of the worst case scenario that hopefully doesn't ever happen, but that's our biggest fear, is losing our child altogether. And that is a scary one, and you kind of detach from people in that stage. The next one, where it's the added one, being that this is 7 stages, is testing, which I thought was really good because we're seeking realistic solutions. So you're finding healthy ways to cope. Good things, not the bargaining where you're like, oh, if I do this, they'll do that kind of a thing, but more of where you're like, okay, I'm going to start seeking counseling. I'm going to start taking care of myself. I'm going to start putting myself first so I don't end up in the same pit, right? And the testing stage is really where most of my moms start with me, working with me, because then if they're ready to be in that stage, maybe they're not there yet, but they're ready to be there, then I'm able to help them. For the moms that are wanting to sit in the anger and wanting to sit in the depression, it's hard for anyone to help them at that point, because as you know, if you've experienced this situation, you have to reach that point where you're like, enough, I need to change. And then it's like, okay, how do I do it? And that's where I come in. So after the depression, you go into testing, and then lastly is acceptance. And acceptance is finally finding the way forward. And like I said, these 7 stages of grief, they're not one size fits all. You might skip one, you might end up spending more time in one than another, bouncing around, and so forth. And even once you hit acceptance, you can go back, because let's face it, every time you get shocked again, I think we do in a way kind of go backwards. Hopefully not for as long of a period of time as we did initially. So that's the goal. So if you have any questions, let me know. But I thought that was quite interesting, and I love the additional 2 steps. And this is the Kubler-Ross model, which is that's who put out the initial 5 stages of grief, and they have modified it to include these other stages, which I think are crucial. And those are 2 that I lived in a lot. So that was the shock and the testing phases. So hope that helps somebody out there. And again, I'll put my link below to my discovery call, and hope to talk to you soon. Thanks. Have a good weekend.